Hi, a late Sunday night reflection on a Sunday morning show of yesterday, the Sunday show. Now, I like the Sunday show, and I like it particularly since Martin Geissler has been the lead presenter on it. I think he's one of the best interviewers and presenters that BBC Scotland has, certainly, and across the channels, and indeed I think he stands on a national level as being a very effective and powerful political interviewer. And that's been manifested in many of his shows, some of which I've clipped before. So when I watched the Sunday show, I was particularly interested in what was going to be said about the deposit return scheme, the DRS. Now, one thing's beyond shadow of a doubt, the DRS has been a controversial policy, controversial in its implementation, and not just controversial for the usual reasons that Holyrood was doing something that England didn't like, and with the independence background to all of that, but controversial across the industry. Now, it's fair to say the industry had their case to make, and it was a valid case and it had to be listened to. Whether it was adequately listened to in advance or not is a matter of dispute. But I would say that any form of regulation, anything that places a burden on industry of control, by and large the reflex action is that they don't like it. It's very rare that industry and commerce welcomes a government scheme which is designed to require them to do something or stop doing something. So to some degree it could be expected that the industry. I don't want to suggest that the whole of the bottle and can industry are a series of mad polluters in line with the oil companies, but they are not liable to be wildly enthusiastic about a scheme that requires something of them, and in a quite complex way. I was also delighted that Lorna Slater is very much her baby, and that she was going to talk, because Lorna Slater is one of the most effective, articulate, perceptive and powerful voices for the Scottish Government. Now, I know many people are unhappy about the relationship of the Greens within the Scottish Government, and there are aspects that well, let's put it no higher than this, many people can quibble about. But on balance, I think it was a necessary thing, and on balance, it's been a good thing. And I like Lorna Slater, I like her style, I like her directness, I like her rigorously logical mind. So I was looking forward to what inevitably was going to be a sparky interview between her and Martin Geissler. And indeed it was. Now, had there been a unionist voice on the programme, or even a voice for the industry, it would have been a very different interview and a very different balance to the interview. But there wasn't. And as the BBC has subsequently observed rightly, it is the job of an interviewer to put arguments and to challenge sitting government ministers with the alternative views of their case. It's notable, in fact, that whenever an interviewer does not challenge a unionist Westminster Tory government person, there's screams of outcry from the Yes movement and other parties. Why were they not challenging the inaccuracies of this minister? Why was the minister allowed to rabbit on? Well, that was never going to happen with Martin Geissler, particularly in the absence, by choice, of any unionist party, any of the other parties, government parties or spokespeople to come on. So he, by default, as a devil's advocate, had to fulfil that role. And he fulfilled it vigorously. Now, can I say that before that, I was a supporter of the DRS scheme, but I was beginning to have some misgivings. All of my misgivings, in terms of whether it was properly conceived or not, were swept away by Lorna Slater's expert and cogent and to the heart of it answers to the points put to her. And she could not have done that as effectively if she hadn't had Martin Geissler put these points and managed to get them in the limited time. He, as any devil's advocating chairperson or front person does, the devil's advocating role is actually a gift to the interviewee. It structures the interview for them and it allows them to respond and rebut. And Lorna did that in spades and effectively, and by the end of it I was much more convinced that the DRS thing was the right thing to do, that the Westminster government's behaviour had been appalling throughout, and I had some sympathies with the industry in it, and perhaps things could have been done better. But generally, there was nothing wrong with it. One note in it, of course, struck a slightly jarring note, the effect of jerking on the leash. Well, it may be something he might have reconsidered with the benefit of hindsight, but Martin Geissler was absolutely right. The devolution settlement is at best a leash around the Scottish Government's neck. At worst, it's a choke chain. And when the terms of the devolution and reserved powers and all the requirements that goes with it, what he describes exactly is what takes place, that a jerk takes place on it. And not everything was clearly within our powers, as Lorna Slater realised, and she was open to dialogue and had been engaging in that. All of that would have been fine. I watched the interview, was glad of it, and thought, well, that's a good basis for Sunday morning, a good proper articulation of the case. I can't say to my astonishment, because they all have form in this, but it didn't take very long for the people coming along crying foul, that Martin Geissler in some way was biased and he was putting the case in a way it had never been put before. Keith Brown put up a fairly hard aspect of it, and I tried to reply and say, well, that wasn't the interviewer I heard, or the interview I heard. Yes, it was vigorous, and he has a vigorous style, but, I'm in favour of the DRS scheme, and this interview I found useful. There then was a progressive pile-on in support of Keith, some of it lacking distinctly in his politeness, and most of it lacking completely in his intellect or any understanding. It was basically a loud scream of, how dare an interviewer on the BBC disagree with something a Scottish government minister is saying. When you cut right down to the chase, that's what it was. So for God's sake, independence movement, or that element of it that thinks it's weak, grow up. We need an adult dialogue, and we sure as hell will need it as an independent Scotland. We need to be able to take the vigour of these things and recognise the role of devil's advocate. I found no real fault of any kind with Martin Geissler's interview, and I posted some relatively recent interviews of his to show that he is equally vigorous, despite squeals that this wasn't so, equally vigorous with the unionist ministers when they come up. So I thought that was worth saying, and I've no doubt I'll have another pile on the basis of this. Well, I'm getting to the age and stage where there's no scar tissue left, so I couldn't give a dog's excrement, whether that happens or not. Bye.